Our theme tonight is water, ocean, Hawaii, island time, wherever you want to transport yourself for Wind Down and Watercolor. That's where I want you to go. So for tonight, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that you can paint ocean water with a focus on getting into the flow state, of course. And we're also going to learn about contrast. So contrast and a little bit about the color wheel, but not too much. It's late. At least if you're on the East Coast, it's late. So I just want to show you a couple of different watercolor techniques, especially some of you are brand new to watercolor. This will be a really great experiment. So I'm going to demo for you for about 5-ish minutes. And then I'm going to turn some music on. I'll keep my examples up on the screen. I'm going to invite you to pick one or two of the different techniques to paint your own oceans. And you can paint along with my demo too if you'd like. And I'm going to do a little bit of a meditative reading as you paint so that you can really relax, really be in the moment, and just let go whatever happened today, this week, this month, this year. A little bit of release for you. So let's get started. If you have questions, if this is your first class, and even if not, if you have questions, you can always ask me in the chat. I always have it up on screen. So all you need is paper. I'm using pretty thin watercolor paper. I ripped up some bigger pieces tonight just because that's what I felt like doing. Sometimes I like this look of this like ripped edge. And they make paper like that too. So you can do that if you have regular paper by just folding it over. So if you want to have a little bit of fun tonight, feel free to do that and try something different. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to demo. So 4 different ways that you can paint water. There's many different ways, but these are the 4 main ways using our watercolor techniques. So this one is wet on wet. And for this one, I wrote my very scientific name, wet on wet blobs. I did blobs of water and I dropped color into it. And I used different shades of blues and greens. It's hard to see on the camera, but in person, when the green dried, it like faded into the blue and it looks really, really cool. So that is wet on wet. This is also wet on wet, but a different brush stroke that we're going to use to do that. So you can see it dried a little bit differently and has a little bit different movement than this one. You can also do dry on dry. So this is hard if you're using a palette like dry watercolors. I was using a palette. I just used like very thick paint with my watercolors. Oh, cool, Tammy. You're using the same colors. And then this one is wet on dry and using a little bit of black to vary the color and make it a little bit grayer. And then this one I want to show you is the wet on wet technique. And this one is sort of what I did during creative hour where I did swirls. I just left more white space between my swirls. And then I went in and filled them in with like lighter colors and did some white pen mark making on top of it. So I'm going to show you real quick how to do these. Yeah, so also tonight, so contrast is what we're talking about. Color mixing, varying your colors. And what varying your colors does is it adds depth to your water. It adds texture to your water. Because you know, if you imagine if this was just one blue color, you may not even know that it's water, you know? And you can also after class add marks too. I added some white pen marks on top of mine last night. Not sure if we'll have time for that, but we'll see. All right, I'm gonna show you the wet on wet first. So both wet on wet techniques. I'm just using my very simple travel watercolor palette. That's all I'm using tonight. I'm gonna use my Flightum brush. Erin and Jenny are making me smile in the chat over here. So grab a little bit of water. Now my water is very dark because I was just painting in creative hour, and also this way you can see it. So for this wet on wet technique, I honestly just did some like very big, what I interpret as waves. So however you interpret waves, give it a try. Just put some water on your paper. You may not be able to see it very well, and that's okay. And then you want to get some blue on your brush. And I'm just picking any blue. And then you can drop it right in your water swirls. Now my paper is buckling a little bit. This is where we were talking about tape in creative hour. It does come in handy a little bit if you're using a lot of water on your paper. So this is what I'm calling the blobs. I kind of just came in, I started with those swirls, and then I just intuitively let my brush go wherever it wants. And then to add contrast, you can go in and add blobs of different shades of blue. And you can add green. So if you think about it, sometimes in the ocean, you can see there's a green tint to the water. And you can add a little blue so it's not as green. And then when this all dries, because we're using wet on wet, you're not even going to know what it's going to look like before it dries. So it's a really cool surprise. If you're a perfectionist, this is a good way to surrender and let what be will be. So that's my blob method, wet on wet blobs. Let that dry. Yes, Darcy just said she loves her fly done brush. That's what I'm using right now. More than her expensive brushes. And I do too, because you see, that's what I use almost every class. And I've been using this brush forever and it's still like perfect. I love it so much. Now, the next one on my technique, if you want your waves to have more white space between them, if you want them more defined, you can kind of do the same thing, but you just want to use a little less water. And I would say make your waves a little more defined. You could even have a wave that goes up like this if you want to get wild. Wild Wind Down Wednesday. So you can do just a few. I would recommend doing a few at once for this method. Otherwise, your water is going to bleed and your colors will bleed a little bit more than you probably want. So I'm just dropping some blue there, some blue there. And then I'm going to add a little bit more water. Maybe a little wave here just for fun. And now you can see the contrast really well here because we have all this white space. Whereas in this one, it's all drying together. So it all comes down to how much water you're using. And you don't have to do this whole thing wet on wet. You can then grab some of your paint from one of the waves and keep adding contrast. If you want to do an actual horizon line and do a sky, the darker water would be in the front, and then it should get lighter as you get towards the horizon line, if that's something you want to experiment with. So this is sort of what I did here. I just kept doing it a little bit more and I let it dry and then I added more layers on top. So those are little swirls. And then two last real quick before I let you get into the flow, if you're not already there, is wet on dry this, you can just grab some paint, wet brush on dry paper. You can do some of the swirls we talked about. You can do little just blobs of color and layer them to create contrast. And contrast is just these different shades together and how they actually make it look like it's water, it's moving. And then the last technique, if you do want to try this, I'm going to do it on this same paper, is dry on dry. Now, I'm not technically doing dry on dry. I'm going to do some really thick. I'm going to dry my brush as much as possible. And then I'm going to put on some really thick paint so that it really looks like this. It's not absorbing a lot. I mean, it's hard to even demo right now because my brush is so wet. Give me one sec here. All right, this should work a little better. Okay, so my brush is pretty dry now from a paper towel. And you see how that is so much different? So you can add a lot of texture and movement and contrast that way if you want to play around with dry on dry. Again, that's just very little water and basically a dry brush or a nearly dry brush. And you can also combine all these methods as well.